Matt, if you could please, thank you. All right, so if you are just now joining us, my name is Monica Beavers, Director of Client Services with our team here at GreatCo-Ops. You have joined the GreatCo-Ops Risk Management webinar, and we are excited to have you with us today. I will, before we get started, we will go over the agenda and kind of what to expect for today. We will have introductions here shortly. We will then begin with why risk management matters, emerging risks and risk issues, risk management for co-ops, and then in today's session with Q&A. Again, feel free to use the chat box if you have questions throughout the session, and we will answer those at the end. So beginning with our introductions, I mentioned my name is Monica Beavers, Director of Client Services, and a little bit about what I do. My main goal is to listen to the needs of electric cooperatives yourselves and work with our team of experts to develop and tailor services to meet your needs and help you reach your goals, serve your members and your community. Prior to joining the team at GreatCo-Ops, I spent about 10 years at the Texas Statewide Association, TEC. I would now like to pass it over to David Summer for his introduction. David?
Thanks, Micah. Welcome, everybody. Glad you could join us. My name is David Summer, and my field is risk management. So I have a PhD in risk management and have a certified risk management professional designation, and have been teaching risk management for nearly 30 years, and now work with GreatCo-Ops in helping co-ops to develop formal risk management programs to help them better achieve their goals. Matt.
Thank you, Dave. Excuse me. Thanks, David, and thanks, Monica. Welcome to everyone here today. We're so delighted that you joined us. I'm Matt Gilley, the founder here at GreatCo-Ops. My background, for those of you who don't know me, my PhD is in business strategy, and blessed to work with co-ops on strategy and risk. Our team also does leadership development, coaching. We do employee surveys, a variety of HR projects for co-ops and so forth. And we're just delighted to have you here today to talk about emerging risks and risk management for electric cooperatives. So let's start talking about why risk matters. When you look into the future for electric cooperatives, I think it's easy to say that the environment for electric cooperatives is changing rapidly. It's very different than when I started working with co-ops about 22 years ago. Back then, it seemed to be anyway a much simpler business, and things are becoming more complex all the time. And a co-op success, we're convinced more and more that a co-op success is going to depend on your ability to anticipate change, which is becoming more challenging all the time, to develop a shared vision among your team, your employees, and your board, and really also a shared vision with your members about what the future is going to look like for energy and for your cooperative. Your future success is going to depend on being able to execute on that vision, and a big part of executing on your vision is understanding and having a process for managing risks. Whenever we do strategy work with co-ops, I love to show this slide, and it's a cautionary tale really about the pace of change in our industry. And of course, there's that saying that the early bird gets the worm, but also let's not forget that the second mouse gets the cheese. And we like to talk about really the risk-aware mouse gets the cheese. There's a lot of pitfalls out there for electric cooperative leaders today, more than ever. And this issue of being able to assess your risks and plan for them and track them and mitigate them and have a risk-aware culture that your team understands from top to bottom and that your board buys into is really critical to your success. So let's talk about some emerging risks and risk issues for electric co-ops that we're seeing at the clients we work with. So first really is around risk management. And this is more of a risk issue, but co-ops, we believe, have to do a really good job of understanding risk start to finish and have a process in place for managing them. Now, co-ops have been managing risks effectively since they started in the 1930s, or you just wouldn't exist and you wouldn't have the kind of success you've had as an industry. But more and more, it's becoming evident that a sophisticated approach to risk management is important. And that's what we're here to talk about today. And like Monica said, and to share the tools with you. If you want them, we're happy to share our tools with you. Also, strategic planning, as I mentioned, you have to have a common vision for the future and really spend more time, I believe, than ever developing and implementing a sophisticated approach to strategic planning and strategy execution and performance measurement to help you anticipate what's coming at you over the horizon and be prepared. Another is misconduct. In fact, a co-op CEO told me the other day that he thought that the biggest risk his co-op faced that's unmitigated currently is related to misconduct among employees or directors that affect the operation or the reputation of the co-op. So that's another big one. And there's a bunch, of course, around human capital management. Things like, and we've surveyed thousands of co-op employees over the last couple of years. That's one of the biggest things we do is employee surveys. And it's surprising to us what we've seen over the last couple of years in terms of abusive supervision in the workplace not being discovered and not being managed or mitigated or eliminated. And as we all know, there's a silver tsunami coming in terms of retirements, but there's turnover, increasing turnover, at least from what we're seeing with some of our clients, increasing turnover. It's non-retirement related turnover, just people deciding to remove themselves from the workplace or for the really from the labor market, and of course this wave of retirements we have, and that leads to the importance of succession planning as well. Of course, always we have legislation and regulation related risks. This member evolution is bringing with it a new host of challenges and risks for electric cooperatives as well. No longer is energy just energy to many members. Environmental concerns and the attributes of the energy are gaining importance, which brings with it challenges and risks. Members want more control over their energy. They want more transparency around the energy itself, but also around what's going on at the cooperative. And we're seeing this growing disinterest in the cooperative business model, where members are viewing themselves really more as customers than members, and as a result, they are not as loyal to the cooperative. They're not as engaged with the cooperative, and that brings with it a variety of risks, including things around activism. And of course, financial pressures are increasing on cooperatives as kilowatt hour sales stagnate or decline, and I think it's still to be determined how that's going to change in the future. I think there's a lot of anticipation that kilowatt hour sales will grow, but currently there are, of course, significant financial pressures on electric cooperatives, and some of the cost containment strategies that co-ops are involved with bring with them various risks. And of course, cyber attacks are more and more of a concern over time. Power supply challenges, that's an ever-present risk. Emerging risks around environment, social, and governance, of course, are an issue. Things like access to capital. There's been questions, and it's thankfully not often, but we've heard questions around, are electric utilities going to see challenges over time in terms of accessing capital due to environment-related concerns? There's governance challenges, DEI-related issues, activism, and more around the ESG issue. Long story short, the business is growing in complexity, and with increased complexity oftentimes comes increased risks. And then the last couple I'll talk about, diversification. So many co-ops, hundreds of them, in fact, many on this call, are diversifying into broadband, and of course, have a history of diversifying into other things like propane and natural gas. And we're concerned that the all-in costs of diversification are being underestimated and perhaps misunderstood. And one of those I'll just mention as my last comment is related to managerial strain. We're seeing co-ops, senior management teams, and really I think it filters down all through the organization. The more complex the business becomes, the more diversified the business becomes, the more we're seeing managerial strain, which reduces their commitment to the organization, can increase turnover, and also the decision-making speed has increased over time, resulting in challenges around decision making and teamwork among senior leadership. So with that, I will turn things over to David, who's going to talk really about risk management, the process of it, the benefits of it, and some of the tools. David?
Great, thanks, Matt. Well, I don't think any of us would disagree that the last couple of years have really been amazing in a lot of ways, not all pleasant, but risk has been just ever present and in our faces every day in so many different ways, from social unrest to supply chain issues to economic turmoil, political tensions, in some parts of the country, wildfires, geopolitical tensions across the world, freak weather events like our here in Texas, our winter storm Uri. That's what that picture in the middle is. I even threw murder hornets in there for fun. And of course, on top of all of this is the ever-present COVID virus that has just impacted everything that every organization does literally across the world, and certainly regard to co-op. So with all that, and with all the issues that Matt talked about regarding co-op specifically, we firmly believe that every organization, and certainly every co-op, needs to have a good system for managing risk, and a formal system for managing risk, not just something that kind of gets done along the way, which, as Matt said, you have to manage risk and just to survive, but not just as something that happens to get done, but in a formal sense, using best practices, have a risk management plan for the organization. So let's start from the beginning and just talk about what we mean by risk. And we're going to define risk here as just uncertainty. That's the key to risk, is uncertainty about anything that might impact the achievement of objectives. And we stress that word, that phrase, achievement of objectives, right from the beginning, because that's how we want to think about risk. It's what might occur that might inhibit our ability to achieve our objectives. That's what we call risk. And then, of course, the issue is, what do we do about it? And so we use this term enterprise risk management that you're probably familiar with, but it's essentially the modern approach to risk management, referred to as enterprise risk management, or ERM. So a bit of a lengthy definition here. So we define it as a process that supports the achievement of an organization's objectives, as we stressed before, and how? By addressing the full spectrum of its risks. Whatever the source, doesn't matter. If it's uncertainty that can affect the objectives, it's a risk, and therefore enterprise risk management should address it. So in the big picture, it involves identifying, analyzing, and then making optimal decisions about managing the organization's risks. So let's delve into that a little deeper and kind of the implications of that definition. First, ERM is a strategic issue. It is implemented from the top. It is a board level concern, a top management concern. It is something that is critical to the success of the organization. It's a continual process. It's not something you do and are finished with. It is something you're constantly revisiting, constantly improving, and on a day-to-day basis, it is impacting decisions that the organization makes. We stressed before, it's concerned with all risks across the organization: financial risk, strategic risk, hazard risk, operational risk. Every risk falls under this umbrella. Partly as a result of that, it is a general management function. It is not something that somebody does. It's not the responsibility of a person in the organization. There may be a person who has oversight responsibility for it, but it is by nature interdisciplinary. Everything the co-op does involves risk, and therefore you need, in doing enterprise risk management, at the table. We'll talk about later literally what we mean by at the table, but at the table you need people from across the organization, because everything that each of those people does involves risks, and how they manage those risks not only impacts their functional area, but can impact the rest of the co-op as well. And so it needs to be a coordinated process, not just telling everybody to worry about the risks in their area. It has to be more coordinated, hence the term enterprise risk management. And that gets to this next point as well. Recognize those interrelationships. We talk a lot in ERM about trying to break down silos. Can't be everybody just managing their own sphere of risk, because that's not how the organization works. Everything fits together, and so it needs to be managed holistically. The goal, when people hear risk management, they often think the point of it is just to minimize risk, but that's not actually the point of enterprise risk management. It's certainly to manage risk, but it's to manage risk to be within the organization's risk appetite. Every organization, every co-op has to be willing to take some risks. And so the goal is not, whenever you find a risk, how do we get that risk as low as possible? It's determining, where do we want to be as an organization? How comfortable are we taking risks overall and in certain areas? And then designing your risk management around that to optimize the risk, not to minimize the risk. And then again, we'll say it over and over again, the bottom line objective of enterprise risk management is to help the organization achieve its objectives. So that's important to keep in mind and to motivate people about. This isn't just another task. This isn't just something you have to do to satisfy, some external party. This is about making the co-op better and helping it achieve its objectives. And so we often like to say, whose job is risk management? Well, the answer is ultimately it's everyone's job, because as we said, everything that everyone does in this organization, it's going to create risk, it's going to mitigate risk, it's going to impact risk on a day-to-day basis. And so again, you're going to have a person perhaps overseeing it, and you're going to have probably a committee who's coordinating it, but ultimately you're trying, as Matt said earlier, to build that risk-aware culture where everybody in the organization thinks about risk, has the same vocabulary to talk about risk, and knows the organization's attitude toward risk and processes for dealing with it. So again, just to stress what we have said about enterprise risk management, everything your organization does, corporate governance, power supply, strategic planning, IT, HR, every one of these functions is intimately part of enterprise risk management and needs to have a seat at the table in order for ERM to really work the way that it should. Before we jump into how to do risk management, let's talk about the endpoint of what are the benefits of doing risk management well. Well, first, you should have fewer negative events. If you are managing risks well, there will be bad things that don't happen. And even I put surprises here separately, because even when something does happen that is a negative event, no matter how good you are at risk management, you're going to have bad things happen. There'll be less of a surprise, because if they are a risk that, if it's a risk that you've identified, you've analyzed, you've made plans for, even if you aren't able to prevent it and it does happen, you'll be able to respond more appropriately. So less of a surprise is always a good thing when it comes to negative events. When those unexpected events occur, you'll get back on track quicker because you'll have plans in place. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you've had to anticipate every possible thing that could go wrong, because making plans for certain things that go wrong will help you respond to other things. I just was talking to an organization recently, and they had been trying to make contingency plans for wildfire risk, and one of their mitigation strategies was, if there's a wildfire in our area that prevents our employees from getting to the office, how are we going to deal with that? Well, in response to that, they planned work from home contingencies. Well, then the pandemic hit, obviously totally different from wildfires, but they were ready to switch to work from home because they had made plans to deal with another risk. So really helps in response and agility when it comes to unexpected events. Employees like to work for an organization that knows its risks and manages those risks. It keeps the employees safer, it keeps the employees' jobs more secure, and it helps the co-op achieve what it wants, which is what the employees ultimately want as well. Of course, it's also going to lead to greater member satisfaction when the lights stay on and when processes and systems work and everything goes smoothly, which is an outcome of good risk management. It also really helps management in terms of giving confidence to the board that they've got a handle on the future of the co-op, because you can't, strategy is critical, but you can't really be sure that you're ready to boldly go into the future unless you can be confident that you've got a good handle on what you're going to do about things that may not go as planned. Ultimately, improve planning, improve strategic planning. Those plans will be designed better if risk thinking is built in from the beginning, and ultimately the organization will make better decisions because they're going to be risk-informed decisions. And then finally, we talked about breaking down silos. And so through this process, there ends up being improved communication across the organization around risks, but really just about around the co-op itself and what makes it run in an optimal fashion. So bottom line is, good risk management is going to help the co-op achieve its objectives. So let's talk about the process itself of enterprise risk management. So it's a relatively simple, at least to describe, 5-step process here of scanning the environment, identifying, analyzing, treating risks, and then monitoring and modifying the process. So let's start we'll go through these in order and start with scanning the environment. So before you start thinking about what your risks are, it's important to review both the internal and the external environment to kind of set the stage. So asking questions like, what are our key objectives? Because remember, what's a risk? It's something that might interfere with achieving those objectives. So what are our objectives? What's in our strategic plan? How are we changing? What are we going to do going forward that we don't do now? All that is going to involve additional risks, perhaps. Are we planning any changes, or any big changes just happening in the external environment? Obviously COVID has totally changed the environment. What's going on in terms of the politics of our state that might impact our environment? What's going on in any internal, external aspect that might create risk? And then finally, as we discussed earlier, you have to think about how much risk do we want? Because you can't really decide later what to do about risks until you've got a handle on how comfortable are we taking risks? What's our risk appetite? So that scanning the environment, often that is done as part of strategic planning. And so that process may already be done if you've recently done strategic planning. And then the next step is to start identifying the risks. So we're asking ourselves again, what might occur that would impede our ability to successfully implement our strategy and achieve our objectives? A variety of things that you can do to help identify your risks. Techniques that we use when we work with clients is interviews with key people in the organization. And that's really valuable, but it's not enough, because you can't just talk to people separately one-on-one and really do the job of identifying risks. You have to have people together. And so we also facilitate meetings where you get key leaders across the organization, say the VPs, together in a room and talk about risks. And that's where I would say you kind of see the magic happen, because even if you've done interviews with everybody individually, once people are in a room talking, things come up that have never come up before. And what one person says sparks something else in an idea in someone else's head and takes things in a new direction. And you really end up getting that holistic view of risk that you need with ERM. Of course, looking at the strategic plan is also critically important, as we mentioned, to know where the organization is going, to help identify risks that may come in the future that you don't have right now because of changes that are being made to the organization. So this is just a sample of once risks are identified, you want to put them into categories that kind of fit logically together. And we like to tie the risks to strategic priority areas. And so These are just samples, but they're common to co-ops. So safety, a very common strategic priority for co-ops. And so you then think about what are all the risks that are related to safety that we face, and then move on to culture employees. What are all the risks that fit in that area? And that again helps tie strategy and risk together, because the strategic pillars are from the strategic plan, and then you're thinking of risks that tie to those pillars that might interfere with achieving your strategic objectives. So it helps with this integration of strategy and risk management, which is really the ultimate goal of good strategy and risk management. So once you scan the environment, identified your risk, categorized them, you then need to understand them before you jump to doing anything about them. So right now, all we've done is come up with a list of risks. We haven't really changed anything, and we don't want to start changing things until we understand our risks. So analysis involves quantitatively and or qualitatively describing the potential effects of the risk on the organization. So quantitatively, when you have data, but frankly, especially for a lot of smaller organizations, but even at larger organizations, some of your most important risks are really hard to just run quantitative models on and to use data to calculate. They're often qualitative in nature, but that doesn't mean you can ignore them. You need to just come up with a way, as we'll discuss, to put metrics on them, even if they're qualitative. The way we think about every risk is in terms of its likelihood and its impact. So for every risk you identify, you think about how likely is this to happen, and if it does happen, how significant would the impact be on the co-op? In thinking about impact, really important not to just think about the obvious direct impacts of, if one of our employees is killed, obviously it's a tragedy, and there's certain direct financial impacts to the co-op, but you also need to think indirectly about what is that going to do to the morale of the employees, what is that going to do to the reputation of the co-op in the community, and so on. So you got to make sure to think broadly. What is it going to do in terms of regulators and how they view you as a co-op and how they're going to interfere? So really important to think broadly about the impact of risks. And then every one of your risks through this analysis process ends up in one of the key tools that Monica mentioned that we're happy to share with you, which is a risk register, which is simply a spreadsheet is all that's really needed. And what you see here is simply one line from that spreadsheet. It's just chopped off the right end and put down below so that it could be big enough to be visible. But this is just one line of a spreadsheet, and every risk would have a line. And so just to run through this real quick. So you've got just an ID number that just happens to be risk 1. You've got a name for the risk. In this case, it is a data breach. As we said, you tie that to a strategic priority area. Here, that is the technology area. That happens to be the one of the strategic priority areas for this co-op. Then a brief description of that risk. So the theft of confidential information of members and or employees by hackers is the particular risk we're worried about. That risk and every risk is assigned a risk owner. That is the point person for that risk. And it's important in choosing these risk owners. You could just say the CEO is the owner of every risk, and ultimately that may be accurate, but it's not very helpful. You need someone who can pay close attention to that particular risk. So you don't want to go too high and have a small number of individuals with a large number of risks that they own, but you also don't want to go too low and have someone be a risk owner who doesn't have the knowledge, the expertise, or the authority to do something about a risk. So you kind of want to start at the bottom and go as high as you need to go to get to the person where you say, this person understands this risk and has the ability and authority to do something about it. These are often VPs, but they don't have to be at that level. Some risks might be someone below a VP, but every risk has to have a risk owner, so you have some accountability and someone to go to when there's an issue with this risk. Then before you jump into thinking about what is our current risk level for this risk, data breach in this case, you first need to think about we talked about risk appetite before. Risk appetite is kind of the big picture for the organization. Risk tolerance is more narrow for each particular risk. So what is our risk tolerance for this particular risk? And you see down here, we've got, low, modest, moderate, and high. And not every risk will you have a low tolerance for. There may be some risks. If you're going into broadband, you're obviously comfortable taking some risk there. And so you're not going to say, we don't want to take any risk. But in this case, they say for a data breach, this is just critical. We cannot have this happen. We have a very low risk tolerance. Then after you've decided where you want to be, that's your goal, your target, you want to be at low risk, you go and look at where you are. And as we said, you're going to look at that current risk level in terms of likelihood and impact. And so you need scales for those. And so these are the scales we use. I won't go into great detail on these, but just as you can imagine, it's critically important that everybody be on the same page in terms of, if the scale is 1 through 5 for likelihood, what does that mean? What is a 3? What is a 2? And so here's a sample likelihood scale. And notice it's more fine grained on the low end than on the high end, because once a risk is more than 25% likelihood of happening, you have to plan for it to happen, right? If it's going to happen about once every 4 years, say at 25%, or once every 2 years at 50% or higher than that, it's less important to be real fine grained around that end. But it does really matter whether something is a 1% or less event, a 1 in 100-year event like a pandemic, versus something that is 2 to 10%, 11 to 25, et cetera. So nothing magical about these cutoffs, but it is important to be more fine grained on the lower end. So that's likelihood. Impact is more complicated, because impact is by nature multidimensional. As we said, you got to think broadly about the impact, and it's not just how much will this cost if it happens, because some risks, the direct cost really isn't the critical point. So certainly we're going to look at the financial impact, from a minor financial impact up to severe financial impact that threatens the co-op with bankruptcy. But we also want to think beyond the financial impact in terms of what's going to be the operational disruption that might occur because of this risk. Is it going to be from limited in just one area, or is it going to affect multiple areas? Is it going to be a complete operational disruption? We also want to think, as we said, about reputation. How much bad publicity is going to arise out of this if it should occur? How wide of an impact would it have on a reputation? And also regulatory and legal. If this occurs, aside from all the other impacts, what are going to be the regulatory and legal impacts of this event? And so these, go 1 through 4 from minor to catastrophic. But notice there's a lot of verbiage there to make sure that people really understand what we mean by each of these levels. And also important to note, if you might have something that, maybe in financial, operational, and regulatory, it's a 1, but it's a 3 in terms of reputation. Well, that's going to go on your risk register as a 3. You don't average them or something. You go with the worst area of impact. So using those likelihood and impact scales, you analyze the risk usually through a discussion, but often led by the risk owner, to determine what is our current likelihood and impact. Then from there, so here it's a 4 likelihood, 3 impact. We go to our risk map, which is just this color-coded, often called a heat map, for our different levels of risk. And so the one we just did was a 4 likelihood, 3 impact. So you go up to a 4 likelihood over to a 3 impact. Well, that's in your red zone. Obviously, that's a high critical risk. I do want to mention real quick, important that the top left and the bottom right are not the same color. The reason is things that are highly likely to happen, we often think of those as our biggest risks, but they're really not. The things that are really likely to happen, but when they do, they're not a really big deal. those are not the things that keep you up at night. Those are the things you can plan for, you can budget for. You want to certainly try to drive that likelihood down, but those really aren't your most critical risks. Things that don't happen very often, but can have a massive impact, like say a pandemic, that is a much more critical risk than something that happens a lot but doesn't have a big impact. And then of course, these red zone areas, those are your worst risks with high likelihood and high impact. So in this case, we're a 4.3, that's a high. Okay, we're not very satisfied, right? Our risk tolerance was low, but our current risk rating is high. So we clearly need to do something about this risk. This is a top priority to address. And so we come up with some proposed risk treatments. These are just some sample risk treatments for data breach that this co-op came up with. Then after developing those treatment plans, you then say, if we do these things, where do we think we're going to end up in terms of what we call the residual risk, which is the risk left over after we do our risk mitigation. And so in this case, they say, we started at a 4.3. We think if we do these 3 things, it'll get us down to a 2 in likelihood and a 2 in impact. Again, you look at the map, a 2-2, you're in the green zone. Bingo, your colors match exactly what you're going for. You've got to where you want to be. So we then ask, is your residual risk acceptable? In other words, do the colors match, right? So yes, we're satisfied with where we are. We don't need to do any more. Then you have these 2 seemingly innocuous columns, but really important. So the status, are you in the planning stage of doing these mitigations? Are you in the executing stage where you're in the midst of doing these things, or are they completed? And then that then leads directly to, what is our next review date? When are we going to come check in? That's what makes this a living document. You constantly have review dates coming up where you're saying, okay, it's June 1st. Let's go look at, and there's going to be a further document that describes the precise details of these risk treatments. And you're going to go say, what did we say we were going to have done by June 1st? What's been done so far? If we're behind schedule, how do we get back on schedule? What's left to do, et cetera. And so that, again, keeps this from being something you do at the beginning of the year and set aside until next year. That's not the idea. This is something that's going to be utilized throughout the year. And it's really kind of the key day-to-day tool that is used. And so every one of your risks is going to be recorded on that risk register. And then you'll use this risk map usually to plot maybe the top 10 risks. You'll put wherever they belong here. That's a great tool to show the board, to tell them at each meeting, kind of here's our top 10 risks. Here's what's changed since our last meeting. This risk is new to the map, or this one has moved off or is moved significantly on the map. It's a good summary risk tool to just put those key risks and keep them top of mind and easy to monitor. All right, so that step obviously took a long time, and the reason for that is you don't want to jump into this next step of making decisions until you're sure you've really got a good handle on analyzing that risk. Now, we already talked a little bit about risk treatments, because those end up going on the risk register. And as we said, the goal of risk treatment is you look at where your risk is now compared to your target risk level. If they're not where you want to be, you come up with some proposed responses. You try and measure the impact of those responses, and then you look at where you're going to end up afterward as your residual risk. And hopefully, again, your colors match. You get where you want to be. So again, that we're going over that quickly, but obviously in practice, that's a really time-consuming part of the process, because that's where you're actually making the decisions of what are we going to do about all of our risks. So we've scanned the environment, identified risks, analyzed risks, come up with risk treatment, risk mitigation plans, and begun to implement them. The final step, although you see here, I don't really like saying the word final step. This is a continuous process. You're never really done. But next is monitoring and modifying the risk management plan. As we said, this is an ongoing, continuous process. You're never done with enterprise risk management, just like you're never done with strategic planning, right? You may spend more time on it at certain times, but then you're going back to it throughout the year. So why is it an ongoing process? Because as we've talked about, at the beginning, the world changes quickly, right? The co-op environment is changing quickly. All your individual organizations are changing quickly. And so the risks are going to change. Certain risks will go away. Unfortunately, more often, new risks are going to arise, things that may have literally not existed before, or maybe just something you hadn't identified that now you have. And so you need to add that to the register and do the analysis. Even risks that remain doesn't mean they're static. Risks are very dynamic. And so this year, think of inflation risk, right? A couple of years ago, that would have not been seen probably as a real significant risk. Today, it's a much, much different situation. And so you're going to change your assessment of likelihood and impact. Your treatment plans are going to change. You're going to find out that certain things didn't work well and you need to come up with new treatments. Other things may need to add additional treatments to what you planned originally to get the risk down to where you want it to be. And of course, if the organization changes its strategy, risks are related to achieving your strategic objectives. So if any of those strategies or objectives change, then your risk management plan has to change. So certainly that's why we say strategic planning and risk management go together. When you're doing strategic planning, that's going to totally overhaul your ERM plan as well. So typically we recommend that at least quarterly, the ERM committee that we'll talk about get together and review the risk register. It's not starting from scratch, it's just reviewing things and seeing if things are if you're on track with the mitigation plans, if there's anything that you feel like you've missed, if there's any new things that need to be discussed. So quarterly basis, you're reviewing that risk register. And then every year, you need to go through this whole process again of scanning the environment, just like you often will do with strategic planning, right? But you have to go get together and do brainstorming on identifying new risks, what's changed in the past year, analyzing those risks, et cetera. So again, you're working with it all throughout the year, but there are going to be key times when you're particularly focused on it. I want to stress here how important, and you hear this all the time in anyone discussing enterprise risk management, that tone at the top is crucial, because no question, we talked about risk registers, we talked about reviewing these quarterly and going through this process annually. Yes, there is effort involved. There's no question about it. And everybody in the co-op already feels that they are very busy and perhaps overstretched. And the thought of an additional process may not be welcomed when it's first introduced. So it's important that there be tone from the top, from the board and from the CEO, that this is something we're going to do and why we're going to do it. And it's not just more work and more processes and another spreadsheet. It is something that's going to help us all do our job better. Once we get over the pain of getting it started, we're going to realize this helps us in our daily work and helps the co-op to better achieve its objectives. And so setting that tone at the top and following through on that is critical to make sure that it gets done. Once it gets done, people will appreciate it. But when it's first introduced, there can be some pushback because it is more meetings, yes, no question, and it involves some effort, but it will make everyone better at their jobs and help them achieve the objectives of the co-op, which is what everybody wants. So I want to talk a little bit more deeply about the specific components, the tools that are involved in having a formal co-op risk management program. So we're going to talk about a risk management policy, a risk management committee. We've already talked about the risk register and the map, and risk mitigation documentation. So as with any important function in the organization, it is helpful to have a guiding policy document. So this is just a sample one. And again, we can share this, but this document is just going to establish the framework for your risk management process. So it's going to describe, why do we do this? What are we trying to accomplish? What all is involved and who is involved in enterprise risk management? What are our key specific ERM policies and procedures that we follow? What tools do we use? What are the key definitions in terms of what do we mean by likelihood and what do we mean by impact? What do we mean by a risk? What is a risk owner and what are their responsibilities? So all that summarized so everybody knows what we mean when we say we're doing enterprise risk management. So that's a key component. The really critical key component on a day-to-day basis is you need a risk management committee or an enterprise risk management committee, whichever you want to call it. And that committee is responsible for implementing the risk management policy. So they're the ones who are going to be doing the scanning of the environment. They're going to be the ones who are doing the brainstorming to identify all the risks, doing the analysis of those risks, completing that risk register, et cetera, selecting the risk owners, and getting their assistance with completing the register when necessary. So that committee is central. They are the ones who are most involved in thinking on a day-to-day basis about the ERM process. It's critical this committee have representation, as we said from the very beginning, from all the major functional areas of the co-op, because every major area is critical to the overall risk profile of the organization. And so you need their perspective or you're going to miss things, and you're going to miss risks, and you're going to misanalyze risks if you don't have everybody's input. That's also key to breaking down those silos that we talked about. You need communication across the co-op. Everybody needs to understand how what they do impacts everyone else. What goes on in IT for IT security has a direct impact on member services. And you have to make sure that's what's being done or you must understand at least what's being done to say increase IT security. You need to understand whether that's going to negatively impact the member experience and how that could be dealt with to get the security without the negative member experience. This ERM committee usually involves all of the VPs of the organization, and sometimes the CEO. It depends on the organization, but it's common for the CEO to be involved. Sometimes it's just the VPs. It can be others, certainly, if you feel like there's somebody else that needs to be on here to give us the full perspective, but that's typical. So these, as I said, tone from the top, these are important people who are going to be doing important work. As we said, the other key component is your risk register and your risk map. So we've already discussed those. But remember that risk register is going to have a summary of your risk treatments. But this is where the action is, right? This is where things happen. The rest of it is identification and analysis. This is where change happens. And so we can't just have everything's written out in the spreadsheet. We need backup documentation. So you need risk mitigation forms for each of your risks. So for each risk, you're going to have that summary of the risk treatment in the register. But on this form, you're going to document that in detail. So you're going to talk about, you're of course going to say what the risk is and the description just from the register, but also what are we currently doing? Because most of these risks, you probably are already doing something about some of these. So what are we doing about each of these risks currently? And what are our plans? You had them summarized up above, but here you give more detail about exactly the steps we're going to go through to implement those plans that were summarized on the register. Critically, it's also going to talk about what resources are required. We may need personnel to implement this. We may need capital to implement this. And so that's going to be documented there. And then, as we mentioned earlier, critically, that timeline. When is everything going to get done? When are we going to review it to see where we are and what we have left to do? As you see here, again, the status, is this something we're just planning? Or are we in the execution phase? Or are we completed? Again, that gets moved to the register. And again, also from the register, where did we start with and where do we think we're going to end up at the end of this mitigation? So those are those key tools. So just to summarize those real quick. If you're going to have an enterprise risk management program, again, as we said, you're managing risk already, but this formalizes it. So you've got a risk management policy that says this is exactly what we mean and how we do it. We've got the people who are in charge of it. We've got the tools that they use on a day-to-day basis, and we've got documentation for everything we say we're going to do about our risk. So let's summarize all that. That was a lot, obviously, but I hope you feel that it made sense, and that if your organization was doing this, if you're not already doing this, and we'd welcome any input if anybody has any thoughts when we move to Q&A about about what you currently do and how it could be improved. But bottom line of messages that we're trying to get across today is, first, the risk profile of co-ops is changing, and it is not just changing because it has always changed. It is changing at a rate that is unprecedented. And you can say that about the world at large, but no question it is true about co-ops. And therefore, you need to spend a lot of time thinking about risk. You need to think very broadly about risks, not just the things that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, but looking out, scanning the horizon and thinking about risks that may come up that you're not dealing with today, but we may be dealing with them a year from now or 5 years from now that we can start planning for. Because a lot of these things you can't turn on a dime. You need to be thinking about these things as they're coming, because it may take a long time to prepare. So with all that, we believe that risk management is absolutely critical for a co-op's success. If it's going to achieve its objectives, you need to have good risk management, and we believe that requires a formal risk management plan. We also tried to stress again and again, risk management planning and strategic planning can't really be separated. One, one drives the other, and then vice versa in the other direction. Your strategy determines where you want to think about your risks, but then what you do in terms of mitigating risk strategy is going to go back and impact your strategic planning. So those two need to be integrated. And then again, as we said, requires a formal process. So that's the big picture of what is involved in enterprise risk management. I want to stop sharing my screen here. What we hope is that after hearing all that, you have a good sense of both why you need to manage risk and you need to do it in a formal way, and the specific sort of tools that need to be implemented to do it. As we said, all of those are free to you regardless, and you could try to implement those, and we are certainly happy to talk to any of you about any questions after this meeting. But right now, does anybody have anything they would like to ask or any comments they would like to make about co-op risk management?